So I said, get in the car. And actually they closed at 2:45 because they, you can only take so many people with one practitioner. So they got him in and she gave him a strong oral antibiotic and said if it doesn't help, just to go right to ER. So hopefully this will do a little bit until we can get to see his regular diet.
So you're planning on trying to see him tomorrow?
I don't know. We'll see how he took one pill at 4:30 and he's supposed to take one at 11. So we'll see the red. She drew a line where the red was going to see if it kept going up his foot. If it goes up his foot, we'll go tonight.
Yeah.
But thanks for asking.
Yeah, for sure. And then we want to remember too, I forgot this morning about Rebecca Momity's dad. He's in the hospital and not doing well.
Hmm.
Do they know
69.
what was wrong with him?
It's this morning, they still didn't know. He's not really responsive. He's like, he's answers to yes or no questions, but isn't really holding any conversations or anything. And 69. They ruled out a heart attack, but as far as I understand.
And is he in Pennsylvania?
Yeah. She was going there this afternoon.
And as I understand it, probably doesn't know the Lord.
Well, I asked her that and she said, yes, he
Oh,
did.
okay.
So,
Beth was under the impression that nobody in her family.
yeah, I was too. So
Okay, are we on?
we're live, yeah.
Oh, okay. Get all that live across the YouTube world. Welcome to Medieval Times. Oh, it's going to be exciting tonight. Or I could say that every night. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But hopefully you'll enjoy what we're doing tonight. So let's pray together. Father, we thank you for what you're able to teach us through your word, but also sometimes through the example of other people's lives, through the good things and the bad things that people have done through history. And we pray that you would enlighten us through what we're going to look at tonight, that you would give us answers for whenever people make accusations against Christianity that may be unfounded. And we pray that it would just be a time where we can learn with an eye toward being able to use what we learned tonight in order to further your kingdom and to bring glory to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, what comes to your mind when you hear the word crusade?
Guys on horses with spears.
Guys on horses with lances and spears and shields. Of course, there were a lot of that before the Crusades, too. We talked before about the tournaments and all of that and the jousting. What else? So you got a picture of guys on horses.
That song, Onward Christian Soldiers.
Yeah, marching off to war with the cross of Jesus going on before. Okay. Let me ask you, in what is the normal context when someone you hear talk about the Crusades? In the media or maybe personally, what's the context when people usually bring up the Crusades?
It's usually bad mouthing Christians.
Yeah, why?
When you say you love, you did all this bad stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's why it's important for us to know what we can about the Crusades so that we have an answer. Because I suspect most Christians, if someone brings up to them, yeah, Christianity is not so great. You guys brought about the Crusades. I think most Christians probably don't have anything to answer that, a way to answer that, or anything to say. So tonight, hopefully, will be instructive for us. All right. So first of all, we're going to look at the necessity of the Crusades, or we could call it, maybe necessity is not a great word. What's the background? What brought it about? During the 11th century, Islamic Seljuk Turks advanced into the Near East. Now, let me just briefly explain them. I think we talked about them before, but there were what are called Turks or Seljuk Turks that came into the area that we now call Turkey, named after them, after they got there, who came in from Asia, northeast of Turkey, And they came in and conquered the area in which the Muslims had grown and then adopted Islam. So they became Muslim. So we're talking about the Turks, we're talking about people that were ethnically not Arabic, but took on the religion of the Arabs, the Muslim faith. And they had advanced then not only from Turkey, then down into the area that we might call the Holy Land. So they came into this area, Salt Lake City Green, into this area. They came from this direction, so they conquered this region over here, present day Iran, Iraq, came over into what is Syria, to Palestine, and then down the Sinai Peninsula as well. And the cities that had been very important to the Muslims, Mecca and Medina, and adopted Islam. So, having taken those areas over, now, and I should say as background, the Arabic Muslims, from what I can gather, didn't really bother Christian Christian pilgrims too much. I got a feeling it's going to be one of those nights where I say words that are totally unrelated to what I'm talking about. But the Seljuk Turks, from at least reports that are brought back to Europe, threatened the security of Constantinople. They were trying to invade that, and also having seized the holy places of Christendom, sometimes forbade pilgrimages to the Holy Land or harassed pilgrims that were coming there. And of course, that put great stress upon the pilgrims, and because taking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a very important thing. They viewed Jerusalem as the center of the earth. I just thought now of a map that I have seen that I wish I had put on here, a map of the world drawn by a European, and at the center of it was Jerusalem. So they really thought of Jerusalem as being the center of the earth. And they revered the sites associated with the life of Christ as sacred and holy places. And they believed that they could draw nearer to God by visiting those places, even earning forgiveness of sins. And so to be kept from visiting those places, to be kept from taking pilgrimages to these holy sites, not only was an inconvenience, like, oh, I was hoping to go there on vacation, but it really affected their spiritual life and what they thought was even their salvation. So it became very important to them. Both the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, which remember is over here, Constantinople is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. We might have at one time referred to it as the Eastern Roman Empire. You know, the Western Roman Empire is centered in Rome and Italy here. So the Roman Empire was divided in two long before the Middle Ages. And the church was also divided somewhat later. But the emperor of the Byzantine Empire and pilgrims desiring to travel to the holy places appealed to European Christians to drive out these Muslims so it could go back to the way it was, and for Constantinople to not have the threat of being overrun by these Muslims. So, is it true, as some contend, that Muslims came to hate and attack Christians because of the Crusades? Well, that's an excuse possibly that's been given in recent years, and especially in view of the attack upon the United States in 9/11. We were told that the reason that occurred is because of how Christians massacred Muslims back in the 12th century, 11th century. But the facts are that Muslims have been attacking Christians for more than 450 years before Pope Urban declared the First Crusade. They needed no incentive to continue doing so, to continue to attack. They were going to do it. Up until quite recently, Muslims remembered the Crusades as an instance in which they had beaten back a puny Western Christian attack, not as a reason to attack Christians. All right, any questions about what I'm calling the necessity or the background of it? Okay, next, the initiation then of the Crusades. At the Synod of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II called upon church leaders and French noblemen in an open field to embark on a holy crusade to free their fellow Greek Christians and the Holy Land from the Turks. This is what he said. This royal city, talking about Jerusalem, situated at the center of the earth, is now held captive by the enemies of Christ. She seeks, therefore, and desires to be liberated, and ceases not to implore you to come to her aid. He urged them to wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. Now, the authority for such a call came from the quote unquote vision of the universal sovereignty of the Holy Father, unquote, with Urban referring to himself as spiritual ruler of the whole world. Okay, got the picture? Pope Urban II says, I'm the ruler of the whole world because of the authority given to Peter, and God the Father is sovereign over all the universe, and therefore we need to go and wrest the city of God, Jerusalem, from these infidels, so that I can have my rightful place in ruling over it, along with the rest of the world, and the sovereignty of God can be understood as well. The response was overwhelming, with those present enthusiastically answering, God wills it, God wills it. Urban II enjoined them to wear the blood-red sign of the cross as a token that his help will never fail you, as the pledge of a vow never to be recalled. People became convinced that this task was God's work and that they were fighting a holy war. Those marked with the cross were called crusaders, from the Latin crux, or cross, and their military campaigns became known as the Crusades. Pope Urban II promised plenary indulgences to those who went. Now, a couple of words there that we don't use every day. Let's make sure we understand. First of all, what is an indulgence?
They could pay for, is it less time in purgatory?
Right. So we could just summarize it as salvation, really. It's forgiveness of sins, which could mean less time in purgatory. Later on, it will be clarified that basically you do not pass go, you go straight to heaven. Now, but indulgence itself has to do with forgiveness of sins. So what is plenary? What does that word mean? You ever been to a conference and you have workshops you go to, and then you also have a plenary session?
Includes everything.
Right. In this case, includes everything, all of your sins. So you can get forgiven for all of your sins by going on a crusade. Now, if you are a spiritually minded person, and remember, everybody in Europe at this point, at least claims to be Christian. And so they're all interested in going to heaven. They all understand that. They believe that they are sinners, and without forgiveness of sins, that they will go to hell. And even as a good Christian, they'll probably go to purgatory for a long while. So for them to hear, I can get salvation by going on a crusade, that's very appealing. And so many people decided to go. Let's look at what the motives were. That's really encompasses the first motive, but we'll talk a little bit more about that before we look at some others. All right, so the first motive was a religious motive. It is to free the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, from the Muslim Turks, or also called infidels. Now, Christian Europe feared the Muslims who had taken over much of Spain and Asia Minor. So you think about the map of the Mediterranean here, and Europe is here. On one side, on the other side of Greece is Asia Minor, and on this side, the last area in Europe is Spain. And the Muslims have taken both of those areas. And so it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that they're going to keep pressing in, as we know that they have already, because we've already seen the Muslims come over the Pyrenees Mountains from Spain into France. And do you remember who was it that defeated them? Or do you remember where? Or when? Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, defeated them at the Battle of Tours. Does that ring a bell? And then went back across the Pyrenees into Spain. All right, so that was a real threat. I mean, all throughout Europe, even if they were miles and miles away from the border, they still heard about the threat of the Muslims invading Europe because they were coming from both those directions. Probably people in England felt relatively safe, but the rest of Europe knew that they could be invaded at any time. And in addition to that, Christian Europeans were livid over the control of Christianity's most holy sites by these infidel Muslims. Acts of penance had developed over the years to include pilgrimages as a major means of forgiveness, especially to the sacred places of the Holy Land. Disruption of such means of salvation could be seen as blasphemous. You know, you're keeping me from gaining what I need to for salvation, to give forgiveness of sins. And so not being able to take a pilgrimage was a major problem. Another phase of the religious motive was the protection of the Byzantine Empire against the Muslim Turks. It was hoped by the popes, if they as they responded to the emperor of the Byzantine Empire for help to come protect Constantinople, it was hoped by the popes that in not only Urban, but those following, that in responding to that call and helping them, that they would maybe in that way heal the breach between the Western and Eastern churches and restore Christian unity once again. Although the factors to come were also legitimate, that is, the other factors I'm going to give you, other motives that were there, the religious motive is the major reason for people embarking on a crusade. All right, any questions about this religious motive? All right, the second motive is economic. And particularly this refers to Italian merchants. The Italians were the ones that were picking up supplies from other parts, from the East, especially from Arabs, and then transporting them across the Mediterranean Sea to ports in Europe, particularly Italy, Venice and other places. And then those products would make their way into the shops of Europe. Well, the Italians wanted to break the monopoly of the Arab merchants that were delivering the products to them. And so they had a vested economic interest in lessening the power of the Muslims in general. In addition, overpopulation and famine in Europe caused many to seek relief in these expeditions to the East. In other words, their economic motive was, we're all starving to death here, there's too many of us, so I'll go on a crusade and maybe I can find something to help us out financially. So that's the economic motive. Any questions about the economic motive? All right, thirdly, there was the love of adventure. As a result of feudalism, many knights relished the ideas of combat and travel. Remember, we talked a long time ago about knights and how they arose to positions in throughout Europe, and they enjoyed fighting. They had to come up with fighting games in order for them to compete against one another. And some have called this love of adventure a wanderlust. You know, there's a desire just to see other places and to have adventures, to fight some battles. And so that was one of the appeals to especially those that were knights, but also, you know, some common people that just wanted to travel. Any comments or questions there? All right, the fourth motive was the hope of plunder, a desire to gain riches through war. Very few people became rich. In fact, the vast majority of them were bankrupted. And as David told us last week, you know, the Templars had a role in that in promising people that they would give them a check that they could cash at the other end by giving them all their possessions, and you know, most of them never made it back. And those that did finance themselves to get there, because it took some money to travel that far to provide for yourself for as long as you would be gone. By the time they got back, they had nothing left, or less than nothing. Most medieval people were quite well aware of this and did not consider crusading a way to improve their financial situations. In addition, the casualty rates on the Crusades were usually very high, and many, if not most, crusaders left expecting not to return. At least one military historian has estimated the casualty rate for the First Crusade at an appalling 75%, for example. For example, 13th century crusader Robert of Creseques, it's French, I'm not sure how to say it, stated that he had come from across the sea in order to die for God in the Holy Land. So many of them just had that purpose. By comparison, American losses in World War II ranged between about 1.5 and 3.66%. Remember, First Crusade, death rate was 75%. Any question about the hope of plunder? Some, but not many had that idea. Most realized that would never happen. Another motive for kings was territorial gains. They hoped that they would be able to find some territory over which they could rule, over which they could become a king. And that did happen for some. The sixth motive was, it relates to the first one, but maybe more specific, and that is salvation. The first one, that religious motive, is more the idea of freeing the Holy Land and things like that. But this motive is tied to the fact that popes promised soldiers plenary indulgences to all who participated, and immediate entrance to heaven to those who lost their lives. Now, does that sound familiar? What's that sound like? That's what the Muslims are told. Yeah, if you die in jihad, you go straight to paradise with 72 virgins. Well, what the Pope is telling Christian soldiers is not much different. The cross was worn on the clothing of those who went, as we said. Now, salvation was not the initial enticement to go on a crusade, but rather it was an apocalyptic expectation that the world was coming to an end and that the end of time would center in Jerusalem. It was believed that the time had come for Christendom to rally around the needs of Jerusalem and perhaps hasten the coming of Christ and the end of the world. Now think about the time frame here. This is towards the end of the 11th century. It was believed by many that just before the beginning of the 12th century was an extremely relevant time to think about the apocalypse and the coming of Christ. Because anytime there was a change in millennium, people's thoughts were directed that way. It's like, you know, Y2K. right? How many people were predicting sometimes years before that, in the 1980s, but it's still related to the end of the millennium that Christ was coming back and they were going to have the end of the world. It was going to be the apocalypse. And Y2K was going to be brought about because everything's run by computer and all the computers are going to shut down, right? Remember that? And so this is how they interpreted time. Apocalyptic expectations rose as millenniums ended and began. As Christians contemplated the second advent, it weighed heavily on their minds that the holy city of Jerusalem was in the possession of infidels. How can we accept, be looking for Christ to return when his own city is controlled by Muslims? That just seemed to be out of kilter. That Muslims have been in control of Jerusalem for several hundred years was not so important than that they were in control now when Christ was about to return. In addition, Christians had become more interested in pilgrimages to holy places during the 1000s in an effort to become more holy themselves. So the rate of pilgrimages picked up during the 1000s, the 11th century, especially as you went on. And of course, the most important site to make a pilgrimage was Jerusalem. Okay, those are the motives for going. Again, the religious was the most important motive, but some had these others in mind as well. Any questions about the motives? All right, let's look at the campaigns themselves. There were literally hundreds of crusades, but we're going to focus on the major ones. The first crusade, in fact, the first crusade really has to be divided into two parts, which you'll see as we go on. And the causes were, let's see, I don't have, yeah, here we go. The causes of the First Crusade was, as we've already mentioned, from Urban II, to relieve the Turkish threat on Constantinople, because the patriarch there had asked for help, not only the emperor, but the patriarch, the equivalent of the Pope of the Eastern Church. And then also to relieve the Holy Land from the rumored harassment of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem by Muslims. The leader of the first part of this first crusade, sometimes called the unorganized crusade, was a guy by the name of Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit preached throughout much of Western Europe, gathered support by common people to join him on the crusade. Now, Pope Urban II had anticipated taking a year to organize everything, and then the nobles would lead this. But Peter the Hermit said, no, we can't wait. And he went around preaching and getting people to join him. And so they, as a mob, basically started moving toward the Holy Land. So that's called the unorganized part of the crusade. This was in 1096. Oops. That's Peter the Hermit preaching for people to join the First Crusade. So two parts. The first one is that led by Peter the Hermit, which was mostly German peasants that joined him when he preached throughout much of Western Europe. And he was aided. I like to call him a sidekick, but they really didn't work together. It just sounds cool to have Peter the Hermit and his sidekick, Walter the Penniless. Walter appealed to French peasants. And this ragtag bunch made up of serfs left a path of massacre and death as they pillaged their way across Europe. Because they didn't have money to buy supplies. They lived off the land, so to speak, but the land was that which was owned by people, and being farmed by people, and they just stole whatever they needed and killed whatever they needed whenever they needed to as well. Now, Peter had been to the Muslim occupied Holy Land 2 years prior to Urban's call. And he later said that he saw Christians chained, beaten, and killed. Don't really know whether that's true or not. Peter was a swarthy monk who had not bathed in decades. He rode a burro that, according to several eyewitnesses, bore a remarkable resemblance to its rider, and probably didn't smell any worse either. In 9 months, he gathered 20,000 European peasants to fight the Muslims. As they journeyed along the Rhine River, Peter began to lose control, and his motley crew slaughtered entire villages of Jews. Upon their arrival in Constantinople, complaints of robbery poured into the emperor's office. Not wanting them to linger in his city, the emperor ferried these untrained peasants across the river. So get the situation. These thousands of peasants had come into Constantinople and were causing havoc. So the emperor graciously provided a means by which they could get quicker to the Holy Land to get them out of the city. And so ferried them across the water there from Constantinople over into Asia Minor, or Turkey, we call it today. The Tarfers, who were a group of wild peasants, would sometimes lead the charge into battle armed only with sticks. Reportedly, they sometimes cooked and ate dead Muslims in a sacred cannibalism. After pillaging Eastern homes for 2 months in Europe, they finally then marched into Muslim territory, and after they left Constantinople, came into Asia Minor, they marched straight into a Muslim ambush only 50 miles in. The Turks invaded the base camp of the Christians, and going within the tents, they destroyed with the sword whomever they found, the weak and the feeble, clerics, monks, old women, nursing children, persons of every age. But they led away young girls whose face and form was pleasing in their eyes, and beardless youths of comely countenance. The only survivor was Peter, who had gone into Constantinople to beg for supplies, and he missed out on all the fun. Peter joined the next wave, which we'll come to next, but he deserted the second part of the First Crusade when food became scarce at the siege of Antioch. So the result of the unorganized part of the First Crusade was failure. All of those who went on that crusade were either killed or taken slaves, except for Peter. Any questions about that part of the crusade, the First Crusade? Sometimes it's listed separately as the unorganized crusade or the peasants' crusade, things like that. No questions? All right, let's go to the organized part of the crusade, the First Crusade. This was led by kings made up of knights. So kind of the opposite of the first one. Although 90% of the 15,000 crusaders who ended up surrounding Jerusalem were foot soldiers and non-combatants. This group of about 43,000 fared much better. They captured, first of all, the city of Nicaea. This picture, it was drawn showing the crusaders throwing heads into Nicaea to try to discourage them from continuing to fight. They beheaded Muslims that they found outside the city. and threw their heads over the walls. They captured Nicaea and Antioch and Jerusalem. To do so, they had to overcome a formidable and quite unfamiliar style of fighting on behalf of the Turks, who used Arab horses and light swords, which could be used one-handed from horseback to slash an enemy on the gallop, as well as the hit-and-run ambush tactics of horse archers. Oops, I already said that. Okay, here we go to where we were fighting. Conversely, this would be the first time a Muslim army had been exposed to a Western European heavy cavalry charge made by mounted knights. So on the one hand, you had Arabs on horseback or Muslims on horseback with small swords able to move quickly and slash at their enemy, or people with bow and arrows on horseback. But then you've got the knights charging in heavy armor and charging into the Muslim army in front of them. Nevertheless, partly with the aid of siege warfare, the Crusaders were remarkably successful. Here on the map, you can see. Oh, let's see Nicaea on this one. It was on the other one. It's over this way, Nicaea. And then we're going to come to Antioch and eventually Jerusalem. Following their victory at Nicaea, the crusading soldiers had experienced numerous evidences of the supernatural, including a comet with a tail shaped like a sword, and the shaking of an earthquake, red glowing sky, and a great light in the form of a cross during the siege of the next place, Antioch. And they said they glimpsed angels, various saints, and dead crusaders leading them into battle, carrying white banners and riding white horses. Now, it's hard to tell with accounts like that coming from battle what they saw, what they didn't see. This is what they said they saw, and who knows? The siege of Antioch turned into a long, drawn-out nightmare for both sides as starvation set in. Many crusaders lost heart and began to slip away back to Europe. Many more died of disease and hunger. During the winter of 1097, the crusaders were reduced to eating their horses, a desperate act for any medieval army. And still, the great city of Antioch held. In March of 1098, excuse me, the arrival of English ships carrying food and siege equipment helped the Crusaders immensely. And they were finally able to put serious pressure on the formidable walls. Seeing the hopeless situation that his garrison faced, the Muslim commander sent out a call for help to Kerboga, a prominent Muslim warlord to the east. On the night of the 2nd into the 3rd of July, 1098, the Crusaders, partly through subterfuge, partly through skill, took possession of a crucial tower and managed to fight their way in. By mid-morning, all Muslim forces in the main city had been killed, the survivors retreating to the citadel. The Crusader victory over the ancient Christian city of Antioch, where, as you remember, the name Christian was first used, on June 3rd, 1098, was interpreted as a miracle by those present. Before they could celebrate, however, or even recuperate, Kerboga, the Turkish lord of Mosul, arrived with a countless and innumerable throng of 40,000 soldiers, consisting of Turks, Arabs, Egyptians, Africans, and Persians. It's quite obvious that these people, said the Muslim Observer, talking about the Crusaders, are completely mad. They are a presumptuous race. Doubtless they have every confidence in their courage, but by Muhammad, it was a bad day for them when they entered Syrian territory. So this Muslim general quickly blockaded Antioch. And so those who only the day before were besieging the city of Antioch now became the besieged. Worse, by the time the Crusaders took Antioch, most of the supplies had been depleted by the Turks during their lengthy besiegement. And that forced these wild Franks to eat leather shoes and drink horse blood. Then a pestilence struck the Crusaders, and many died, including reportedly nearly 50,000 women. Okay, so now the Crusaders are desperate. They met together for deliberation, and it was decided by common consent to send a deputation to Kerboga, proposing that he agreed to do one of two things: either let them depart and leave the city to the Christians as a possession forever, the city which had been theirs in the first place, and which now by the will of God had been restored to them, or let him prepare for battle and then submit to the decision of the sword. So that was just war logic from a Western European, and was at the heart of the message delivered to the Turkish leader by the Christian delegation. Kerboga sent the following message to these Frankish lords: "What staggering audacity has possessed you that you should have marched against them with armed forces when in their view, you and your king and your people are," let's see. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the message sent by the Frankish lords to Kerboga. Okay, I got ahead of myself because Kerboga has a message back to them in a minute. So they're saying to Kerboga, "What staggering audacity has possessed you that you should have marched against them with armed forces when in their view, you and your king and your people," and word Muslims, "are guilty of invading Christian lands with unbridled covetousness and insulting and killing them all. If you had any kind of rule of law and wanted to act fairly towards us, we would negotiate, reserving the rights of honor, and demonstrate to you with incontrovertible arguments what ought to belong to the Christians." So basically they're insulting him. Further underscoring the religious nature of the quarrel, the delegation continued by telling Kerboga that if he were to embrace Christianity, then they would surrender Antioch to him and take him for their lord. But if he still refused, that they would fly immediately or prepare your necks for our swords. As might be expected, Kerboga was so transported with anger that he could barely speak, and finally responded by saying that we took Christian lands by means of our remarkable strength from a nation, the Byzantines, scarcely better than women. He continued, "Moreover, we think that you are mad to come from the ends of the earth, threatening with all your might to drive us from our homes when you have insufficient supplies, too few arms, and too few men. What are you thinking? Not only do we refuse to accept the name of Christians, but we spit upon it in disgust. To respond briefly to the message you have brought, return, you who form this delegation, to your leaders swiftly and tell them if they are willing to become Muslims like us and renounce the Christ upon whom you seem to rely, we shall give them not only this land, but land of greater wealth and size." So you kind of turn it around on them. Should the Crusaders refuse this offer, however, he said, they will undoubtedly die horribly or endure the exile of eternal imprisonment as slaves to us and our descendants. And I shall save all those who are in the flower of youth of either sex for the service of my master. Well, the Christian delegation returned to Antioch after hearing Kerboga's retort. The famished, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered men concluded there was nothing left but to sally forth and meet the hordes besieging them head on. Then a curious and timely discovery occurred. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a vision that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross, was buried at the Basilica of St. Peter within the city walls. Peter began digging, and sure enough, a metal shard was found, declared by those witnessing the event to be a true piece of the lance. This proved to be inspirational for the Crusaders. They ordered a 3-day fast, The little food available was given to the horses. Then everyone in Antioch, lord and commoner, marched through the city squares, stopping at churches and calling on God's aid, barefoot and crying, beating their breasts, so grief-stricken that father would not greet son, brother would not look at brother, to quote a guy who was there. Finally, on the morning of June 28th, 1098, everyone received the Eucharist and offered themselves to die for God if he should wish. Then some 20,000 crusaders, the entire army minus 200 left to defend the city, issued out of the gates of Antioch to the sound of blaring horns. Few had retained their horses, so some rode oxen, and most proceeded on foot. Never expecting the vastly outnumbered and weakened Franks to sally forth and meet their much larger and well-rested army, the Muslims were shocked. Doubly so, as the desperate Christians fought with untamed fury. Contemporary accounts speak of half-starved knights bristling like porcupines with arrows, darts, and javelins, but still moving forward and fighting ferociously. The Crusaders' tight formations eventually caused the Muslim horsemen, used as they were to overwhelming their enemies with arrows, to panic and retreat. To pursue them more effectively, the relentless Christians mounted the horses of those Muslims who were dying and left their horses, gaunt and suffering from hunger, on the battlefield. So they exchanged their dying horses for the Muslim horses of those that they were killing. The Franks' berserker-like determination eventually won the day. The Battle of Antioch became one of the First Crusade's most astounding victories against the forces of Islam. All medieval chroniclers portrayed it as a miracle, citing angelic hosts, whom many crusaders insisted on seeing, fighting alongside the knights. However one wishes to interpret such claims, the fact remains. Modern military historians have attempted to come up with a more rational explanation for the Franks' success, but the task is difficult. So says the Crusades historian Jay Rubenstein. He says, how did a force as spent and starved as the Crusaders manage to overcome a superior, well-fed, and well-rested adversary? Even the Islamic chroniclers marveled. The Muslims were completely routed without striking a single blow or firing a single arrow, disgustedly wrote one. The only Muslims to stand firm were a detachment of warriors from the Holy Land who fought to acquire merit in Allah's eyes and to seek martyrdom. The Franks killed them by the thousand and stripped their camp of food and possessions, equipment, horses, and arms with which they re-equipped themselves. So in this manner, the Battle of Antioch came to take pride of place in crusading lore. That's the Battle of Antioch. Any questions about that battle? Well, here's Peter Bartholomew. Apparently to indicate that he was telling the truth about the lance, underwent an ordeal by fire in which he walked across hot coals of flames and was able to do so. I guess his feet were burned, but he didn't stop. Next is Jerusalem. Approaching Jerusalem, the Crusaders found that the Muslim governor had destroyed the wells outside the walls, poisoning some, dumping earth in others. He drove outlying flocks and herds into the city and then drove Christian inhabitants who outnumbered the city's Muslims out into the Judean wilderness. He strengthened the towers with sacks of cotton and hay to absorb the shock of bombardment by French catapults. Then he sent a message to fellow Muslims in Egypt, imploring them to send armed aid. Following the many supernatural signs that they had seen, the princes of the Crusaders followed the advice of an old hermit who was living on the Mount of Olives. To their surprise, he exhorted them, if you will attack the city tomorrow, the Lord will deliver it into your hands. Okay, now, do you believe this guy or not? You know, there's this old guy living on the Mount of Olives. He says, attack. Well, they did. They attacked. And the attack failed. So a long siege was in the offing, but that really favored the Muslims because they had a good supply of food and water, whereas the Crusaders had neither. Coupled with high temperatures and hot winds, they became desperate for water. In addition, disease and desertion had reduced the number of Crusaders from the 43,000 at Nicaea to around 15,000 at Jerusalem. One company of soldiers departed Jerusalem for the Jordan River to be rebaptized. There they picked up palm branches and went to the port of Jaffa to find a ship to take them home. There are accounts of peasants within the army dying from drinking dirty marsh water infested with leeches. Success depended upon obtaining more siege equipment, including siege towers, scaling ladders, and what are called mangonels, which are huge catapults that took 50 men to operate and could hurl a 300-pound stone 150 yards, as well as balls of fire. They needed those things. The lack of supplies to build this apparatus was remedied by the arrival in Jaffa of 6 Christian vessels carrying food and ropes, nails and bolts. One early morning, a priest related to 2 princes that a dead bishop, one who had been the first to kneel before Pope Urban in order to join the crusade, had appeared to him in a vision, commanding the crusaders to purge yourselves of your uncleanliness. Let each one turn from his evil ways. Now, listening to the other old hermit didn't work out so well, but this guy said he saw this bishop, and so they listened. The penance required for their selfishness, greed, and quarreling, he said, was to fast and march around the city of Jerusalem barefoot. Now, anybody ever been to Jerusalem? Walking around that place barefoot would be very hazardous to your feet. It's, a lot of rockiness there. An attack on the 9th day, he said, would be successful. Sort of sounds like marching around Jericho, doesn't it? They responded in obedience, much to the enjoyment of the Muslims on the walls. After this, the Mount of Olives was ascended, where Peter the Hermit and 2 other preachers exhorted them, saying, now that we are on the very spot from which the Lord made his ascension, and we can do nothing more to purify ourselves, let each one of us forgive his brother whom he has injured, that the Lord may forgive us. At this, princes who had been quarreling with one another and contending for power embraced. With renewed resolve, the devices were readied, and on a Sunday, secretly put into place. One of the leaders, Godfrey de Bouillon, tricked the defenders by building a siege tower in one location, drawing the defenses there. It was built, however, in parts so that it could be disassembled and reassembled in another place during the night. And so, having done that, when the horn sounded on Wednesday morning, Christian soldiers scaled the towers in a different location and stormed the walls, shouting, God wills it. For 2 days, the antagonists battled with both sides, fearful of the success of the other. Finally, on Friday, the horn sounded once again with the familiar response of God wills it, as the Crusaders rushed the walls. With the battle raging back and forth, a council was held to determine whether or not to withdraw, when a knight was spotted on the Mount of Olives, waving his shield to advance. No one was able to find out who this man was. Encouraged, the battle was renewed afresh by the Crusaders. Fierce fighting followed, with the Muslims falling back. In taking Jerusalem, the Crusaders slaughtered the inhabitants, Muslim and Jew, men, women, and children, and looted the city of its gold, silver, animals, and household goods. On the Temple Mount, Muslim blood flowed ankle deep. Newborns were thrown against walls. Crusaders torched a synagogue and burned the Jews inside alive. One medieval historian wrote, with drawn swords, our people ran through the city, nor did they spare anyone, not even those pleading for mercy. The crowd was struck to the ground, just as rotten fruit falls from shaken branches and acorns from a wind-blown oak. Another chronicler observed, Heaps of heads and hands and feet were to be seen throughout the streets and squares of the city. By Saturday evening, the Crusaders had exhausted themselves, weeping with gladness over their victory. They celebrated by winding through all the dissipation to find themselves at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There they jubilantly sang praises to the Lord, making offerings and offering supplications. Excuse me. The bodies that were all laying around there quickly decomposed in the July summer heat, resulting in an awful stench. The few Muslims left were compelled to drag the dead outside the city, where they were piled as high as houses and then burned. In December, both inside and outside the walls of the city, it is reported that the stench of death still lingered. 4 small feudal kingdoms were established, opening up the Holy Land to pilgrims. The leaders prevailed upon Godfrey de Bouillon, the one who came up with the fake tower, to become king of Jerusalem. However, he resisted taking a title that he deemed only appropriate for Jesus, the King of Kings. Instead, he desired to be called the Baron of the Holy Sepulchre. And so this final battle for Jerusalem, in which the Crusaders were successful, although in a very barbaric way, brought about a successful conclusion to the First Crusade, as it opened up the city and the surrounding area for pilgrims to come once again. Any questions about the First Crusade, or particularly about the conquering of Jerusalem? And this is where it begins to become a question: how can people who claim to be Christians do such things to fellow human beings and to Jews? I mean, you find throughout the Crusades, we've seen so far in this First Crusade, both the unorganized and the organized part, that there is among Christian Europeans a hatred of Jews. And they think nothing of wiping out whole villages, or in the case of Jerusalem, it was the Muslims that herded them all into their synagogue. But when the Christians arrived, rather than releasing them, they burned the synagogue, burned them all up, all the people up.
Well, partly, I mean, if you're told that you're gonna be forgiven of everything you do, I mean, there has to be part of it, you know, that we're not super concerned about right and wrong.
And I think that they saw themselves in the same light as the Israelites going into the Promised Land. Because remember, much of the Roman Catholic Church centers around Old Testament rituals and customs. And I think that they identified with the Israelites, and which God told to wipe out every man, woman, and child as they came into the land. And so I think they saw themselves as accomplishing the same task in the same way.
There had to be a lot of crusade widows. You know, you
Mhm.
wonder what happened to all these women. They didn't get any adult. They didn't have a
Yeah.
survivor.
But remember too, and I'm not sure if this explains it or not, but there were a lot of women with them, whether those were wives, prostitutes, both. I don't know, but remember the one place I talked about 50,000 women being killed. So there were a lot of women that were tagging along. I mean, what you said is correct also, that there would have been a lot of widows back in Europe, but maybe a lot of them went along. I don't know. I've not seen any figures on that. Yeah, so then who, well, and what's the remedy back then? If you're a widow, what do you do? What options do you have? Your husband dies in the Crusades. Now what do you do? Of course, it makes a difference if you're a serf or if he was a knight. Let's say he's noble, he's a knight. So what do? You marry somebody else. You marry another noble. If you're a serf, maybe it's the same thing. I don't know. But throughout history, for the most part, the way a widow dealt with her poverty was to marry. And we see that in the book of Ruth. Okay, good questions. I don't necessarily have the answers. Any others?
The logistics it takes to feed, 20,000 soldiers, 40,000 soldiers.
Yeah.
The logistics of, organizing all that, if the soldiers are soldiering, then you need a whole nother thousands
Mhm.
to do all that, all the other stuff,
Right.
to,
Even to cook,
to cook,
let alone procure goods and,
all that kind of stuff.
yeah. I don't think any of us can understand what it would be like to be associated with an army, being in an army of that size, traveling. Remember, you're traveling by foot all the way from France, Germany, all the way over. I mean, I hated being in a plane as long as it took to get there. You can imagine how long it would take on foot, and you've got to be fed all the way there as well. Yeah, it would be a logistical nightmare, I would think. So part they're probably thinking they'll live off the land when they get there, but one of the things that left them starving in Jerusalem was the fact that the Muslim ruler there had poisoned the wells or filled them with dirt. So there's no water. Then what do? Let alone food. All right, if there are no questions, then we'll stop there. It will not take us as long to talk about the other crusades. This had a lot of documentation and a lot more interesting things happen. The other crusades will be lesser in length, some less than others. And we'll pick that up next week with the Second Crusade.